This week at Hyde Park on Ada Derana 24, we will be talking about the opportunities for the port industry for terminals as well as shipping industry in Sri Lanka post-COVID, and as we put all our efforts into navigating through this time of uncertainty and difficulty amid a global pandemic. Of course, to discuss the future of Sri Lanka's port and shipping operations, I've invited to our studios at Hyde Park Mr. Romesh David, the Chief Executive Officer of South Asia Gateway Terminals, one of the 3 terminals that Sri Lanka boasts of. Mr. Romesh David, of course, is running South Asia Gateway Terminal, which has a multinational shareholdership, a joint venture between the private and government sector of Sri Lanka. I'd like to ask you a few questions about the shipping and port industry, but maybe we'll start off with your observation of what's happening. I know you all have been continuing to work regardless of us saying stay at home, work from home. What is the outlook for ports and the shipping industry in Sri Lanka?
Yes, Indeewari. I think first, to answer your question, the ports have continued working non-stop, and that in itself was an achievement, because we were possibly the only port in South Asia to have uninterrupted operations. So all 3 terminals worked non-stop. We had no shortages. Of course, we had to take a lot of precautions in terms of the health and safety of our people. We also had to make sure that they were properly compensated for that additionally. But yes, it was a big achievement in terms of continuous working, because the port operates for 24 hours. And we had no interruptions whatsoever.
You did say there were no interruptions. The port continued to operate. Now, world over, we see that 40% of ports have experienced moderate and in some parts even significant decreases in the number of calls of container and other cargo vessels to the port. But what was it like for Sri Lanka? Although we work 24 hours, we know there have been challenges to global trade and other industry. What was it like for us?
It was exactly the same. We had, in fact, if we take year on year, numbers came down in terms of throughput by about 25% overall. That was slightly disproportionate on the domestic front, obviously, because the government put a clamp down on imports. So about close to 40% reduction in import volume and domestic volume, because there was a lack of exports, and transshipment volumes came down by about 23%. And the number of ship calls, usually we get about 300 container ships a month. But this April that just passed, that came down by almost 50 ships.
How hard is it on the port industry with this reduction?
I mean, it's decimating. It takes a lot out of the volume, it takes a lot out of the revenue, and certainly because they're very heavy investment, we can't go on. Obviously, we are confident that volumes have to grow as economies on either side of us, in the West and also India particularly, and Bangladesh begin to start production, and there are green shoots already of things starting up. We think it will go back up, but the likelihood is that we are going to end the year possibly 20 to 30% below what we had expected.
When you say there is a positive outlook, but there are challenges, yes, on Monday we will see most parts of the country's curfew, the lockdown will ease. But given the situation, that doesn't mean globally everything, and in Sri Lanka everything is going to go back to normal. This is a new normal we're talking about. But in that new normal, the port industry, shipping, what are you targeting for? What is your exit plan? What are the policies? We'll talk about the South Asia, the SAGT Gateway Terminals. What policies and plans do you have to specifically navigate through these tough times?
Yeah, so if you look at Colombo, we are 1 port, 3 terminals. So we are 3 distinct entities, but we market to the globe, to the world shipping community, as 1 port. And then shipping lines can choose where they want to be, where they want to get served. So we are going to, one of the slightly positive things that came out of it in a strange sort of way is that Sri Lanka's container port capacity was at capacity. We were at absolute capacity. We did 7.2 million containers last year. We had very little room to grow, possibly another 10%. Now, with this organic drop, we are going to have capacity again this year, and that it has some element of positivity in it, because it means that Sri Lanka can expect to attract some new services, which are likely to occur. And then in terms of the region, I think as we are going to see an additional number of ship calls and possibly volumes moving over Colombo as shipping lines begin to do more transshipment rather than their traditional direct services.
Is this the same outlook even post-COVID? Probably this is the policy, this is the outlook you saw at the beginning of this year, before all these, before the pandemic evolved, before the health crisis and the global trade issues. But what is your understanding of the current situation?
So I think before this, if we look at the year, we were looking at largely a flat year. We were not going to grow too much. Now we are likely to shrink. Year on year, we will go down. But in a strange kind of way, that also presents an opportunity. It presents an opportunity because a lot of the shipping lines, if you take the global shipping line industry, they are facing huge losses because of the cost of running these big ships is massive. So it is imperative that they have to fill those big ships, the really big 18,000, 20,000 container ships. Now, those ships can't go to all the ports. They go to maybe 3 or 4 ports, and they have to be filled. So I think the opportunity is that as a result of freeing up of some capacity here, we are likely to attract some of these additional big ship calls. The number of containers will come down, but we will have greater connectivity, I think, as a result of that.
Let's talk a little about operations of South Asia Gateway Terminals. I know that there were global accolades, there was a lot of recognition in terms of the work you all do. But out of the 3 terminals of Sri Lanka ports, the smaller share is with SAGT. What do you do different here?
Yes, so SAGT is 20 years old now. It was Sri Lanka's first public-private partnership in 1999. And it has a global shareholding, but it is majority Sri Lankan owned between John Keel's in Sri Lanka and the Ports Authority. There's almost 60% of the company. But the big difference was it was a paradigm shift when it started off in the early 2000s, because ports had predominantly been or were only run by the government earlier, by the state. So SAGT was the first public-private partnership. And that made a huge difference. So we brought a lot of innovative changes. And of course, now with the advent of China, the CICT from 2015, that's a much bigger terminal. So SAGT, I mean, ultimately it's our staff, it's the equipment, it's the approach, and it's the customer relationships that we have. Yeah.
In 2014, SAGT was ranked #1 in South Asia and #4 in the world in terms of terminal productivity. That's something that all of Sri Lanka can be proud of. But talking about global competitiveness for the port industry, you did mention about what opportunities may arise given the current difficulties. But for the entire port industry, we're talking about a massive operation here, the labor market to bringing other industries together. And there are other ventures that you say might be possible. Is there anything new that we're looking at right now?
Well, the biggest opportunity is obviously the East Container Terminal, which needs to get developed. Ultimately, ports are about capacity. Ports, particularly those that are transshipment ports, because Sri Lanka relies on transshipment cargo. We have a very small portion of imports and exports of our own cargo. We rely on cargo that comes from other countries and are going to third countries. So that type of port has to continually create capacity in order to stimulate demand. So East Terminal, we have the South Port, we have the South Harbour, we have East Terminal, which is partially built. And unfortunately, we have really missed, we have been continuing to miss the bus on that by delaying the development. It's at least 5 years too late, and it needs to get done fast. So that is a real clear opportunity. Also in a post-COVID environment where Sri Lanka needs foreign investment desperately. This is an early win. It's an easy win, and I think the government recognizes that and is probably taking steps to do that quickly.
We'll talk more on that when we return after this short commercial break. back. Sri Lanka's strategic location places us in a strategically important, geopolitically important center as a hub for the port and shipping industry. But what challenges do we face in the present uncertainty, and how do we navigate through these challenges for a more positive and productive outcome from the port industry post-COVID? We've been discussing with the CEO of South Asia Gateway Terminals, Mr. Romesh David. I would like to talk about the immediate response to the current issues, the pandemic itself. We see that a lot of ports have taken preventive measures. Some ports have started quarantining vessels for up to 14 days before they enter destination port, depending on whether the last port visit was in a highly infected area. What measures have we in Sri Lanka taken from the port industry itself?
Yes, so if we take the ships in Indeewari, what we have, we conform to what the IMO standards, International Maritime Organization standards, in terms of how we handle declarations by vessels coming into Colombo. So prior to coming, the ship's captain has to send detailed a declaration of the state of health of all the crew, where they have been, what their state of health has been. That is assessed in advance of the vessel's arrival here. And then before it docks, before it comes alongside, port health authorities go to the vessel, check it all out, and clear it whether it can dock or not. So we have not quarantined any vessels, but earlier on in the year, starting from February, I think, or January almost, we stopped permitting cruise passengers to come outside, because obviously after the Japanese incident, passengers on cruise ships weren't allowed to come. But cargo vessels, we have facilitated. There have been some hindrances of crew changes, because Colombo as a port also facilitates the change of crew from crew exchanges on the ship. So that has been stopped almost entirely, because we have no flights. But apart from that, we take those precautions on board. On the land side, we have a no visitor policy, so we've stopped. It's only employees that come into the port, and we have extremely stringent health checks on arrival, temperature checks, and we have tracing to make sure we've separated shifts to see that they don't mix up. So we are taking, these are fairly stringent standards that are the same in most other ports as well.
On par with the government standards and what the security
of course,
forces
very
and
much
health authorities are continuing to. Also, World Port Economic Barometer reports a gradual deterioration in the availability of port-related workers in week 18 of the pandemic, where 22% of the ports reached out to mentioning that they face shortages of dock workers. Is this a significant factor for Sri Lanka too?
Thankfully not for Sri Lanka and the port in Colombo in particular. I think that's aided partly by the fact of the commitment of the workforce, but also the fact that we have, as an industry, paid triple time for 1.5 months. So during this period, so starting from the middle of March until the end of April, all 3 terminals have compensated their workforce for the risk element, and also to incentivize people to come to work. Because the thinking was that we did not want to have a situation where, as a port, ultimately a port for an island is a lifeline. So we didn't want to have a situation where the port didn't work.
But this is also challenging because revenues are hit. But how do you pump that the necessary funds to keep the payroll running? And this is something important. But how does that happen from a company's perspective?
Yes, so from a company perspective, we've kept our shareholders and our investors informed. Obviously, the company has had to conserve cash. We've had, if I take SAGT, we've had, whilst we have collective agreements with the unions, and therefore some payments have to continue. We have executives, for instance, have taken a deferral of their increments. We've completely stopped all capital expenditure at this time. But yes, particularly the government, SLPA and ourselves, SAGT, we're losing money. But I think it is important at this stage, it is more important to keep the port running than to actually close, because it is ports and airports for us are very important as a country.
Certainly exemplary. Other industries also have been talking about this, but the challenges they face are multitude. Again, we can't just ignore your workers as well. So definitely an exemplary measure. But with COVID-19 forcing people to maintain strict social distancing, among other measures to limit interaction with possibly exposed surfaces, has the shipping industry had to evaluate how it carries out its operations? Especially you're heavy on the paperwork.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the great positives that has come up. Sri Lanka as a country, we've been struggling with our competitiveness in terms of our ease of doing business ranking, primarily around the complications and the paper-based transactions at the border, customs, clearances, and so on. So I must say that the current port minister, Mr. Johnson Fernando, gave absolute leadership and actually mandated that certain elements of the clearance process need to be done electronically. So after trying to do this for the last 25 years, in the last 1 week, since the 4th of May, we have begun now as an industry to clear cargo in a paperless environment. It's quite rudimentary, but it is a great start and something that certainly we want to hold on to as a trade going forward, because it makes a huge difference to our competitiveness. Importers and exporters are taken, they take that productivity to a different level when you don't have to shuffle paper from pillar to post. The next stage is to make sure that we get government agencies also online. Customs is already online. We need to get all the other government agencies online. So I think that's, in a sort of backhanded kind of way, that's one of the great benefits that will accrue from this.
Talking about a paperless environment, does that mean that they could still work from home?
Yes, I think that's one of the other things, and the fact is that a lot of the contact centers, the points of contact that we now have, people meeting customs officers, people meeting other officers for getting gate passes, for getting delivery orders, completely unnecessary.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, you just tie up delivery orders with electronic payments and it can be done. It's being done all over the world. So we reduce the contact of people. People can still work, but the ability to work from home is far greater.
But in a normal context, other than the situation we are faced with, we understand that the port, the industry itself is heavily employed, and sometimes most of them we see too many people to do too little of jobs. But given the paperless environment, given the transition to a more automated, more online version of the work, does that mean that most of these jobs, where you'll have to create more jobs or maybe find other work for these employees?
If we look at it, the big numbers in a terminal are not those shuffling paper, not those transacting paper. I think over the course of time, as automation comes through, we will have some reskilling needed. I don't think we are talking of job losses, because there is we can, but instead we will have great leaps in productivity. We'll be able to do more things with less people, or with the same number of people. So there's nothing that we are doing now is going to result in people losing jobs, but certainly people are going to have to reinvent themselves. For instance, we have a population of possibly 2,500 to 3,000 what we call CHAs, Customs House Agents or wharf clerks. These are the guys who actually do the work in moving the paper to clear a container from the port or to export a container. Now the type of work they do will change, because now they can work with their smartphone. The guy who did maybe 3 shipments or 5 shipments a day has the ability to do 20 shipments a day. So I think those are the types of efficiencies that will accrue.
Certainly more efficient times ahead.
Yes.
We'll take a short commercial break at Hyde Park to return and speak more on the port and shipping industry of Sri Lanka. We've been talking about the shipping and port industry, but a report published on the 8th of April by the World Trade Organization says that world trade is expected to fall by up to 32% this year due to disruption of economic activity. But we've been talking about how imports are restricted in Sri Lanka and exports, the challenges faced by the industry, the sector. It also predicts, now this report by the World Trade Organization, that a decline of anywhere from 13 to 32%, which will most likely have a greater impact than the slump in trade during global financial crisis of 2008. But how are we looking at navigating through this from a perspective of the shipping and port industry?
Yeah, I think the drop is inevitable. So global shipping is also projected to drop by anywhere between 20 to 30%. And that is much greater than the drop even during the GFC, during the financial crisis. Shipping is in a slightly better place than it was maybe 10 years ago, 10, 12 years ago. There's been a lot of consolidation, so now there are actually a lot less shipping lines, but they're much larger. But it doesn't alter the fact that a 20% drop in volume will render a lot of them unprofitable. And there are some reports that say that if they can't hold the rates where they are in the face of falling volumes, it could wipe out about 8 years of accumulated profits for the shipping industry. So they're staring down the barrel at a $23 billion loss for global shipping if they are unable to hold the rate. So as a result of one of the ways that they are planning on holding the rates is by cutting capacity. So the shipping lines are going to cut capacity significantly in order to maintain, to keep the demand constant, or keep the supply constant with the drop in demand. So for Sri Lanka, that's going to mean also a few challenges for our importers and exporters. I think the government putting the brakes on imports will have a natural consequence anyway. So the reduction in capacity into Colombo, if at all, may not be too dramatic. But on the export side, it could hinder our ability to recover. But if you look at our main export industries, which is tea, garments, the volumes are. The bigger challenge, I think, than the shipping capacity is the fact that demand has fallen off a cliff in the buying countries, in Europe, Western Europe, in the US. I think there's a great unknown at the moment as to how that's going to translate for us. Our export basket is quite vulnerable at the moment. For tea, there seems to be a great deal of confidence that demand for tea will continue, and therefore that will help us. From our perspective also, I think the drop in the oil prices will help us. So that will help stabilize again our need for the drop in foreign exchange. But from the shipping perspective, I think for our exporters, it's going to be largely neutral. They're not going to be too badly affected. The shipping opportunities will be available, though they will have to contend possibly with similar rates to what they had earlier.
You were speaking more on the export and import business also. This may be out of your subject, but let's talk a little about the imports and exports. Yes, imports restricted, but exports, we're talking about diversifying, that Sri Lanka missed the opportunities to diversify well in advance to face these challenges. What do you think about that now?
I think we are going to feel the pain of being sort of a single source export in terms of sheer volume, other than for the traditional exports of tea and now garments. We have very little diversity in that basket. So again, this is like a burning platform. I think our exporters and the country, we have to look for other forms of export. That's critical. I think the seeming shift away from China is going to help us. Sri Lanka has an opportunity again. We are, like you said earlier, slap bang in the middle. We are best located in the South Asian region. We have excellent political relationships as well as connectivity with all our other South Asian neighbors. So we become really a doorway to South Asia. And that in turn, we have the advantage of Hambantota. There's a fantastic port there and a free zone there. So I think we have a whole array of opportunities ahead of us. sadly, I just heard someone say we never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. So, we have to really, I think there are so many things before us today that if we don't start taking some of these concrete actions, how do we improve our competitiveness? How do we make it easier for people to invest in this country? How do we make it easier for shipping lines to choose Sri Lanka as a preference over Singapore or over Salalah or over a Red Sea port or over Malaysia, because they have options. Our ports depend on transshipment business and they can choose to go wherever they want. So I think for us, for Sri Lanka as a trade, from a trade perspective, we have a lot of good things that are happening, but we really have to take stock and move away from or add to the traditional export basket. And I think there are plenty of opportunities to do that.
When you say move out of China, look at South Asia, these difficult times, again, global trade restricted. How do we look at new ways to engage and trade with the rest of the world? Because the demand for our traditional exports or imports from those countries from Sri Lanka are going to change eventually. And within Sri Lanka, we see a lot of inventions, innovations, a lot of manufacturing happening, and so most of the imports will actually be unnecessary going forward, but maybe we'll look at new things. But especially for the export industry, how can we look at new ways to engage?
I think if we take, again, going back to China, there is a conscious shift by companies in the US, companies in Japan, because of the risk that everyone found out. If so much of the supply chain is reliant on China and production in China, that it actually had the ability to disrupt supply chains and the movement of goods and services well outside the Chinese borders. So there is going to be a conscious effort to move to diversify that supply chain and that source. Sri Lanka has the opportunity. I mean, we are a small country, but we do have the opportunity because of our location, because of the fact that on top of that, we're also sitting at the foot of the biggest, the world's fastest growing until now. South Asia was the world's fastest growing economy, part of the global economy. And we have India that is still growing, despite they will see, the whole world will get checked, but India is still a massive market for us, and I think we should concentrate on that. It's outside my remit of expertise, but certainly the Indian market and what it represents in terms of consumption, what it represents in terms of tourism, is where Sri Lanka should really be looking at.
I think it's time we take a short break. We'll return to speak more at Hyde Park. Welcome back. We were at the beginning of the discussion talking about the potential and the government's indication of willingness to develop the East Terminal at the Port of Colombo. And earlier on you did say that somebody said Sri Lanka never misses the opportunity to miss an opportunity. But is this an opportunity lost? Could we have taken this decision earlier on so we could have be more prepared to face the current challenges and maybe be well prepared for the post-COVID era?
I think it's not too late. I think it's still, and well, there's no point crying about what we haven't done, but I think what we should do is what is important. And ECT, or the East Container Terminal, does represent an opportunity for this country. The government has already made some undertaking to ensure that, or to give assurance to Japan and India that any investment in the East Container Terminal will include Indian and Japanese investment, and that's fine. But we have all the framework done. We have the public-private partnership framework. We have definitely, we will, what we do need is commitment on the part of the government to move ahead. And then this can be a flagship investment at a time that the country needs it most. Because, as I was saying earlier, transshipment, we are a transshipment port. Transshipment ports are capacity-led. If you don't have capacity, you will not get shipping lines calling at us. So we have to move forward, and I think the government is very cognizant of that. We have a government that has a bias for action. unfortunately, this has derailed a lot of plans. But I believe that sooner rather than later, within months, we will see some action on that in terms of the government's decisiveness to move ahead with it.
We've been for long eyeing transshipment hub status, South Asia's hub, Asia's shipping hub. We've been talking about a lot of targets and ambitious targets that we have, but somehow policy frameworks have never been aligned, or there has been lack of policy consistency. From the industry, what would you want policy? What kind of rectification in terms of policy would you look at?
I think there are a few good things that have been. We've had a bipartisan consistency in terms of aspiration. From 1977 onwards, every government in power has wanted to make Sri Lanka a maritime hub. And let's face it, we are a decent container shipping hub. We are good. We are up there amongst the 2022 best ports in the world in terms of our volume and in terms of our efficiencies. But being a maritime hub is a far cry from being just a container shipping hub. We have to leverage the fact that we are a great container shipping hub and then take it to the next level, whether it is, we've got to add things like bunkering, crew changing, inviting people to set up their regional offices here. There's no reason why people should have. India is a big market, but it can be served from Sri Lanka. So to have regional officers in Singapore and India don't really make, we can, that is business that we can bring here. We can do things like, maritime services in things like dispute resolution. A huge part of Singapore's maritime offering is the fact that they have maritime courts, they have shipping lawyers, aviation lawyers. These are all things that add to the hub. So there's a whole raft of stuff that we have to take from being just a container transshipment hub to being a maritime hub and a true cargo transshipment hub.
But in terms of policy, what would you want?
So in terms of policy, we've got to, bottom line is it's no different for that as for any other industry. We have to realize that we are no different to every other country that is trying to attract investment. We are no different. We are no different to Malaysia, we are no different to Singapore, we are no different to Vietnam. So what is it that we can do different? We have things that we should encourage people to come and invest here. And we have this mania about foreigners. Let foreigners come. Singapore started, Dubai started. We have these great examples of the success of having investment-led hub economies, Dubai and Singapore, and there's nothing to recreate. We just simply copy, we emulate what has happened there. And we must make that policy transcend the political change. I mean, there has to be acceptance across the political spectrum that this is where we want to be. This is what we want to do in terms of a hub. And irrespective of who comes into power, these are the things that we will implement going forward.
We've been talking about Singapore, and in the current time, Singapore recently announced a relief package for maritime companies, individuals, from the 1st of this month, which includes further reductions in port dues and other relief measures, including credit management measures, and increased co-funding for manpower and productivity support schemes. Has the industry seen any similar moves and assurances by the Sri Lankan government?
Well, I don't, the government has announced that they have a 50 billion rupee package. They probably need 500 billion rupees in order to restart the various different economies. At this point in time, I don't think the ports and shipping industry here, and I probably get hanged by a lot of my colleagues, I don't think we need any handouts now. There is no necessity for a handout by the government. The port industry has already, at the request of the government, given a huge amount of relief to importers over 30 days, because storage on the port is the most expensive storage in the world. And we've already waived almost 40 days of storage, facilitating importers. What I think the government can do is make sure that from a policy perspective, they get things, they do things, and make things easier for business. So let's really concentrate on the automation, on the electronic documentation, on doing away with the bottlenecks and the paper. That is where government can help facilitate. I don't think this industry needs handouts.
So I think it's time we wrap up the discussion on that note. Thank you very much for joining us at Hyde Park. We had with us the Chief Executive Officer of South Asia Gateway Terminal, Mr. Romesh David, joining us at Hyde Park tonight to talk about the port industry and the industry's navigation of the challenges faced by the present uncertain times. Thank you for watching. Good night.